Hey everyone, thanks for joining me again. This is part 9 in the full stack Apollo GraphQL with React and Node tutorial series, and in this video we're going to handle mutations with Apollo Client. Recall previously, or in the last video, we handled just a simple query with Apollo Client, and if you go to your app.js file in the source folder of your client directory, you saw that we brought in this hook from the Apollo React Hooks package, and we implemented the hook right here. This is a custom hook created by the folks at Apollo, and if you've used React Hooks before, which you have if you've been following along with this tutorial, you'll probably recognize this as a custom hook. Right, and what that did for us is it hit the server, and it got that list of earthquakes that we got originally from the earthquake catalog API. And in fact, it only got the first 20 earthquakes because we set up pagination. So just to make sure that you remember, let's go ahead and run the client-side server, dev server. Right, and that brought up our home page, and our home page had the list of the first 20 earthquakes from the catalog. Right, and when we clicked the load more button, we got 20 more. So today what we would like to do is we'd like to make it so that unless a user is logged in, that user won't be able to see this information. So we're going to hide it based on whether or not the user is logged in, or if the user is not logged in, excuse me. So we'll create a login page, and then we'll have a sort of conditional render where if the user is not logged in, they'll be directed to that login page. Right? And we'll be using Apollo Client to help us out here so that we won't be hitting the back end to get the important information. We'll actually look at Apollo Client. We'll look at the cache in the Apollo Client, and if we see that the user is logged in, and it'll be a Boolean value that'll tell us either true or false whether or not that's the case. If the user's logged in, we'll go ahead and let them see this list, and if not, we'll direct them to the login page. So for now, go ahead and head over to Apollo Docs, right, which we've been paralleling this whole time. They have a full stack tutorial that we've been following. Right, and they give us a fair bit of code, so we're going to be pasting in a lot of stuff without actually running anything or actually seeing any results. So I'll try to explain as much as I can along the way, but as soon as we get it all pasted in, we see something in the browser, it'll be a little bit easier to explain what's going on. First of all, they introduced to us the useMutation hook, and that's the custom hook that they provided for us. And we're going to use that to run our login mutation from the front end. So they tell us first that we're going to need a login page, right? So let's go ahead and in our source folder create a new folder called pages, and then within that folder create a new file called login.js. Okay, and then take that initial bit of code that they give, copy that, and paste it in. So the stuff that we don't need from this code is just right here. For their tutorial, they created a couple of custom components. We won't be using those, and we'll be creating our own login form. So you can go ahead and just delete this. Okay, and you see that they have this new query, right? And this is basically using the login mutation. Sorry, not new query, new mutation. And they're using our login mutation, which we've previously created. So we're going to add in a little bit more code below. So go back to the docs page. All right, and we'll bring in the functional component body. Paste that in. Right, and you can see here again we've got this custom hook that they've given us. Right, and this has that. It almost looks like the useState hook, right? So, but in this case, it's useMutation, it's their custom hook. And we're passing in as an argument the login user mutation, which is our login mutation. All right, and then we'll be rendering a login form. Eventually we will. For now, if you could just go ahead and let's just get rid of that for now. And just put in a little placeholder message. All right, that way we can see, we can look at the console and take a look at the Apollo client once we bring that in. All right. So go back to the docs in just a second here. It gets dark early these days. I had to flip on the light. All right, good. So as you can see, the code that we just added, we got rid of the login form component for now. But basically into that login form, we're going to pass as a prop the login mutation. All right, and then we're going to handle that in the login form, which we haven't created yet. All right, but it says first here, we want to use Apollo client, right? We want to actually use the cache, the data that's stored in the cache, to find out whether or not we're logged in. Right, and we're going to do things like save our token that we get after logging in to local storage, and then we're going to use that to set our local state, so that, for example, if we are logged in our local state, we'll have an isLoggedIn variable that says true, and if we're not logged in, it'll say false. All right, so it says here now, use Apollo client in your login page, right? So that's what we're going to do. All right, so go ahead and copy that. Go ahead and put it right in above the useMutation hook. All right, so what is this client? What is it doing for us? Well, we can log the client to the console and see. All right, but we have to make sure that we can see the login page. So in your index.js file for now, well, first of all, bring in the login page. All right, and replace the app component here with login. Now, recall, we're using this client, we're using an instance of use Apollo client here in the login page, and that's available to us because in the index.js file, we've wrapped our whole application with the Apollo provider, and we've passed as a prop the client. So that makes it available to all the children. All right, so now that we're logging that to the console, let's go ahead and take a look at things after we restart the front-end dev server. All right, so we get our little generic excuse me, login page, and if we open up the console, we can see there's the Apollo client waiting there with some information for us. So go ahead and open that up, and in particular, go to the cache, go down to the data. Right, and you see there's nothing there, right? There will be some data there eventually, but for now there's nothing there. Okay, so anytime you want to know what you have available in your in-cache memory, right, or in the cached memory, go ahead and open up your Apollo client in the console and take a look. But for now, go back to the index.js file and put the app component back in. Good. And then we see the list of quakes that we were seeing before. Okay, so back to the Apollo docs. All right, so in our useMutation hook, we're going to pass in the query login user, which we've already done. All right, that's here. But we're going to pass in a little bit more. All right, we're also going to pass in this function called onCompleted. All right, and what this does for us is it looks at the login value that you get. It has this value here that's created in the custom hook. And that's actually, if your login is successful, is going to be the token that we return on the back end. And once we return it here, we're going to set it in local storage to have the value, or using the key token, and the value will be that actual token string that we get. All right, and then here it says client.write data. This is what we can do. We can actually take that data that we get, right, or we can create some new data and put it in the Apollo client. And what we're saying is, for our data object, we want to add a field called isLoggedIn, and we want to set it to true. Okay. Recall, we just looked at the Apollo client's data field and we saw that it was empty. So this will add this field to it with a value of true. Okay, and then before this said data, but we have to change it to loading and error. Right, because we're going to use those to do some conditional rendering. So just grab this little bit of code, right, and put it down below your hook. Recall, we don't have the loading component. We're not using their custom components. We're just going to use, like we did last time, a p tag. Good. All right. And then, of course, if we have a login form, we'll render that. Let's go ahead and create that login form now. So in your components folder, create a new file and just call it loginform.js. All right, and we'll use a form here. We'll create a field for the email input. And then what we're going to do is we're going to create a state variable called email, and we're going to pass it in as the input field value. All right, so go back up to the top. And actually, since we're using state here, we need to bring it in from React. And we'll initialize it as an empty string. And then also, when we enter an email value or we enter text into the email field, we want the change to be handled in real time. So we'll use onChange. And we'll create a function called email handler. And we'll set our state here. And that'll just be the value we get from the field. Alright, so we'll also need a button, alright, to submit this login request. And for this form, we'll use onSubmit. We'll create a function called submitHandler. And we'll also be passing in the e value here. Alright, now here we're actually going to want to execute the login mutation, right? And recall that in our login file, we're supposed to pass that in as props to our login form component. Alright, so let's go ahead and grab that from Apollo docs. Just go ahead and replace that H1 tag with it. And you see we pass in as props login here. We've also got to bring in login form. It's in our components folder. And we forgot to export this. Okay. Alright, so we passed in as props the login mutation, so in our login form we'll have to receive them. We can do that up here. So we can execute it here, we can invoke it here, but we'll need to pass in an object, right? And this object has a field called variables, and then we'll set the email to the email state variable value. Okay, and if you're wondering why we do that, you can go back to the login page and you can see in our login user query we defined our mutation in such a way that we had to pass in the email as an argument, the email value, right? It's a required value. Okay, so these are our variables, it's our only variable, and that's why we put them in here. Okay. So we've done that. Not everything's working. We haven't crashed anything yet. Let's go back to your Apollo docs page. And it says we need to attach authorization headers to our request. Now remember, all of our requests go to a single endpoint, that GraphQL endpoint, and we set that up when we set up Apollo client in the index.js file. Right, you can see that here. We defined something called link, and we used this HTTP link that we brought in from the package Apollo link HTTP, and this allowed us to just enter in a URI and that would make a request for us. You could also just do this with fetch or Axios, but it's nice to use the tools that Apollo has provided. So underneath that URI field, we'll want to add in the headers field. So do that now. Okay, and what it does is it looks at local storage, and if there's a key, a token key, it grabs it. Of course, if there's no key, then it's just going to get a null value here. All right, and we set that in our login page, right? Local storage.setItem, that's where we set the token, right? And hopefully we're getting back a token string from the back end in our login mutation. Okay, so we do that. Now also, and if you look, okay, good, we don't have it yet. We also have this little bit of code right here. And you can put that in underneath the client instantiation. And what this does is it actually allows you to, like just like before, write data to the cache. Right. So before in the login page we used client.writeData, and this time we're just directly accessing the cache because we have it here. All right. So we use the writeData function and we create this data object. Right. It'll have the isLoggedIn field. We don't need the card items, that's part of their project, not ours. All right, and then what it says is logged in, and then it looks at the value and it says bang bang local storage.getItem, and then it uses the token key. Remember, or if you don't know already, the bang bang operator, or what this does is it just allows us to resolve something to either a true or a false value. So if there is a token string, a value associated with this token key, then this will resolve to true, and if not, then it'll resolve to false. Alright, so we're basically done with part 7, and we haven't seen any of our implementations in action yet. We have to add a little bit more. So go to part 8, it's called Manage Local State, and here it tells us we need to write ourselves a local schema. Alright, and this is where you kind of are told how great Apollo Client is. Right? It says right here, what's awesome about Apollo Client is that it allows us to store local data inside the Apollo cache and query it alongside our remote data with GraphQL. Right? So they recommend managing local state in the Apollo cache instead of bringing in another state management library like Redux. So the Apollo cache can be a single source of truth. All right, and you'll find that Apollo cache is really easy to work with. Okay, so just when we deal with with data queries on the client side and not worrying about getting it from the server side, we just use something called the client directive. It's pretty easy. So first, let's write a local schema. They tell us to create a resolvers.js file, but I'd rather just create a file called schema.js. Seems a little bit more intuitive to me. So in your source folder on the client side, create a file called schema.js. Right, and then paste in the code that they give you. Right, and most of this we're not going to need. Right. What this does is it allows you to extend your type definitions from the server side. So we had some query type defs on the server side, and we're going to add one more, and that's going to be the isLoggedIn query. And it's going to get back either a true or false value. All right, we're not using launches because it's not we're not following strictly along with their tutorial. And we may at some point, or you may if you like, add some various other queries and mutations. Excuse me. But for now, go ahead and get rid of these so that our new schema file is it's pretty sparse. Right, and inside of this resolvers object, you can just leave that blank. Alright, so just like before, we had to wrap everything using this GQL function and then put all of the code inside of backtick. So it's just like we did on the backside. Alright, and it tells us we need to initialize the store. Alright, so first what we'll want to do is bring in our type defs and resolvers from the schema file. So you can just go ahead and highlight this gray part. Remember, if these parts are shaded in darker gray, that means that's something they've updated. So you'll want to grab that. And we're putting that in our index.js file. This is the same way we did it on the back end, right? We imported our type defs and our resolvers into the index.js file there. Of course, we're not using resolvers, we're using schema. Right, so also to your Apollo client, add those below the headers. Well, actually our headers were added to the link, so add those below link. And then this little bit here, it's shaded in dark gray, which makes it look like it's supposed to be an update, but we already have it. And that's this bit right here. Okay, so now it says here we've added default state to the Apollo cache, right? That just basically goes ahead and sets up whether or not you're going to be islogged in or not. If you don't do that, then you'll get an error, and we don't want that. You have to have some default state in there. Right, so to query local data, which means get it from the Apollo client, right, we'll add some more code to our index.js file. First, it's the isLoggedIn query, so go ahead and copy that and just put that in up under all of your imports. Alright, so we create this new query called isUserLoggedIn, and we use the isLoggedIn query that we just created in our schema right here. Okay, now here's where things get a little interesting. Oh, by the way, we need GQL from GraphQL tag to use that query. Okay, so now they give us this this functional component, right? And it's right here, and this will do a conditional render. Right, basically, it's going to use the isLoggedIn query right here, and if it gets back from local cache a true value, right, then according to this logic right here, we'll render, and actually it's not pages, we're using the app as the home page. We'll render that list of earthquakes. And if this value is false, then we'll render the login page, right? So this is our conditional render here. Also, to use this query, we need to bring in useQuery from Apollo React hooks. So go ahead and bring that in as well. All right, so that gets rid of those errors. Good. And then what we'll want to do is we'll want to use this functional component in place of app down here. And that's what they've done. Good. All right, so at this point, we should be able to just execute some of our code, get this rudimentary login thing happening. So take a look at your home page. Now you have the login page here. Okay, and it's checking local state. It's checking the cache, right? And if you look at the data field here, it has as your only query the isLoggedIn query, and it's gotten back a value of false. All right, and because that happened, we are rendering the login page here, the login component. So things are working well so far. So remember, if you go back into the server side and you look at your db.js, we were always dealing with this email address here for logging in. So let's use that now to see if our login works. So paste that into the field here. So it works. We got logged in. All right, but we don't have a way of logging out right now, and we'll want to do that. But for now, go ahead and just stop the front side dev server. And for our login form, let's go ahead and center things. All right. You don't have to do things this way. This is just my own way of doing it. We're not too concerned about style here. We're just trying to make things functional, but it would be nice to have this login form off from the left margin and onto the center of the page. Okay, so this is interesting, right? We just ran our dev server, and right off the bat, it showed us the list of quakes, right? We don't want it to do that, though. We want it to make us log in first. All right, so we'll have to set that up in a few minutes. But for now, go into your app.js file, excuse me, and let's add a button, a logout button here, and you can just put it right above all of the Quake data. Well, this doesn't matter if we call it a submit button or not. All right, and then we'll give it an on click. And we'll just create a function called logout handler. Right in here, what we'll want to do is we'll just want to change our isLoggedIn value to false. Right, so go to, sorry about that, go to your login page, and you can see here they have this little bit of code, client.writeData, and then they set the data field, right, which is an object. They set the isLoggedIn field of that object to true. Right, so you can get this little bit of code, copy it, and we can use it our logout handler. So just paste that in. All right, and then of course we want it to be false, right, because we're logged out. Okay, so you see we're getting an error here. It says client is not defined, and that's because even though we pass the client to all of the children, using Apollo provider, we still need to import it, and we'll bring it in using Apollo React hooks, and then we'll have to instantiate it here. Okay, so our errors have cleared. All right, so if we set is logged in to false, then let's see what happens. And by the way, are we still logging the client to the console, or do we? And we're not doing that here, so let's do that. Well, actually, no, because once we log out, we'll see the login page, and that's where we want to look at the client. So we're already doing that here, so it should be good. All right, so go back. You see we've got our logout button here, and if we click it, hopefully it'll kick us off this page and send us to the login page, and it does. All right, so if we open up the console and look at the client, the cache in data, now it says is logged in as false, but unfortunately it has this little residual bit of data. It still has all those quakes. So if we were trying to restrict people from this information, they could still see it just by opening up the console here. I think if we do a refresh, it'll go away. And actually, that's problematic too, right? Because it suddenly logged us back in again. And we'll get to that. There's a few bugs in the tutorial, and that has been one of my motivations for doing the tutorial on my own, just because there's some things that weren't very well done on their end. Although the people at Apollo have done a great job in giving us a great tool. That's not a huge knock on them, but there are a few things that are problematic. So if we log out here, yeah, we still see the quake data, even though it is logged in as false. All right, one thing we can do is, for example, all we did was we set the is logged in value to false, but what about the token itself? All right, so if I console log local storage dot get item and token, all right, what do I see there? Well, you can see that I've still got that token, even though I've set logout to false, or is logged out to false. Right, sorry, is logged in. Sorry about that. Is logged in as false, yet the token remains, and we don't want that to be the case. So what we can do is we can just clear local storage. So going back to your logout handler, just underneath where you've updated is logged in, also do local storage. Sorry about that. Dot clear. Don't forget to invoke it. All right, so one more time, if we log out, we don't see that token there anymore. And that's good. Well, actually, I took away the console log statement. I'm sorry. That was terrible. All right, let's bring that back. And do it again. All right, good. So you see that you're getting this value null. All right, and the reason you get that is because when you try to see a value in local storage, like say you pass in a key to the getItem function, if that key doesn't exist, and it shouldn't because we just cleared it out, then you'll get back a null value. That's just the way that local storage works. And in fact, if we go to the MDN web docs You can see that right here. So the getItem method of the storage interface, when passed a key name, will return that key's value, which we don't have, or null if the key does not exist. And it shouldn't exist because we cleared out local storage. So that's why that's doing that. Okay. So if we keep refreshing the page, we don't see anything. All right, we don't go back to the home page. But what if I stop the application and start it again? Oh, that works. So we're okay there. What if we enter in a bad email address? Well, look at that. It just loads the page for us and takes us right to this supposedly protected page. All right, and if we log out, we refresh, we're okay. So we want to rectify that. So we have to figure out what's going on here. All right, why is it doing that? All right, we shouldn't be able to just see it once we start up the dev server, right? We should automatically get that login page. All right, so we can try it again. Okay, now we get it. Okay, so that's all right. But you might notice that it doesn't happen consistently. For example, oh, sorry about that. Well, I guess our main problem right now is when we enter in a bad email address, we still go to that protected page. So what I wanted to show you was in the index.js file, in this cache.writeData function, right, it's saying that if there is a token key with a value, you know, something that's not, well, if there is a string value attached to it, then you're going to get a truthy value here, right? You're going to get true. And then, of course, if there were no token, like if there was no token on the in local storage, there was no key, then you would get back a null value, right? But let's look at what happens when, say, up here, right? Because here, this is where we're deciding which page to render, right? So even though we are supposed to have a bad email address, which means that in our login component here, it says on completed, after we pass in our login mutation to our login form, right? Once it's completed, it's going to set that token equal to the login value, all right? But what is that login value? You can console log it right here. And just so we know what we're looking at. So I'm sending in a bad email address. We know this doesn't correspond to an email or any user in the database. That's not an email. It's not a valid email address at all, but it certainly won't correspond to any values in the database where the user email fields are searched or checked. Right. Of course, it loads the page, which it shouldn't do. Right. In the console, you can see that here, right, we want to see what the login value is. It says it's null. Okay. So just looking at that, you would think, okay, in the index.js file, down here where it checks to see whether or not you have a token, right, you would expect this value right here to be null. Okay. But there's a little bit of a problem. So maybe right up here. Just console log local storage, all right, to see the whole local storage object. All right, you see right here, it has the key of token, and then its value is null, but it's passed as a string. All right, so that actually looks like a token string to this command here. Sorry, where are we? Down here. Right, so we're saying that there is a key token that does exist, and we can see that right here, and it has a value of, and it's a string value here of null. Right, so it's actually taking that for a token string. Right, and then what it's doing is it's setting this data.isLoggedIn value to true, and we can see that just by console logging data here. Right, so isLoggedIn is true. It shouldn't be doing that, right? But the reason it's doing that is because it's seeing this null written as a string. Right? Usually we don't write null as a string, but it's seeing it written as a string as a token string. So there is a way to fix that. What we can do, and the reason why it's getting null here in the first place is because on the back end, the way we have it set up, and this is similar to the way they had it set up in the normal full stack tutorial, right? We're saying if there is a user with that email, it returns the token, right? And if it's not the user, we didn't tell it to do anything, but it does return a value of null, right? So again, you can see that by logging the login value to the console right here. This login value comes from the back end, right? That's what we're getting after we run the mutation. And you can see, just by entering in a bad email address, right, that it comes up as null. So that's coming from the back end. That's why it's being turned into a string up here as null in quotation marks. All right, so what we can do is on the back end, we can say if there is no user, right, we can just return an empty string. Okay, so if we log out, right, and we enter a bad email address, well, we still get logged in. So there's something else we need to do. Okay, what we can do is we can put a conditional statement in here. At least our login value is an empty string now. We can see that, right? That's login.js23. So we see that line 23. Yeah, it's the empty string. But what we can do is we can make this write data function a conditional. We can put it inside of a conditional. We can say that if actually, we don't even need to do that. We can just say this. Okay, so let's try to log in one more time. All right, and that won't let us log in anymore. It won't show us the protected page. Because before, the way we had it without that conditional is that it was just always writing is to the client or to the cache, it was always writing in the data as is logged in being true, right, which is no good. So that was another thing with the tutorial where it didn't really make any sense. So anyway, we got that figured out. So we log in with, a valid email address. And we can see the page. We log out, we're back to the login page, we refresh, and we don't get that page back. We enter in a bad email address. Try to log in, it won't let us. Good, so that's working now. Then of course, if we don't want, so say you're a developer, you're a front-end developer, and you're told, well actually you're not told, say you're a back-end developer and you're told by a front-end developer, hey, we're going to need a password field as well for this login. We can't just use only the email address. Well, you can change things easily enough to make that work. First, you can go to the back end and into your server, into your schema, right? In your login mutation, you can just add password and string. Make sure it's a string. Then go to your resolvers, or to your login mutation resolver. Pass in password. Pass it also into your get user function in your user API. Right. Now go to your user API, to the get user function, and add in also password as an argument. Alright, and then what we'll do is we'll say here, if the email that we're passing in matches the, we loop over all the users in the database, and if we find a user whose email matches the email we passed in, and also the password argument equals that user's password, then we'll go ahead and return the user, right? But if one of these is not good, then, if one of these doesn't match, then we won't be able to log in. Right, so now go to the front end and go to your login file, and your login user query needs to be updated as well. So now we'll need new variables. That'll be the password variable. Make it required. Alright, and then we'll also have to add that into our login form here. Right, so under email, we'll say password, and that will be password. All right, but here we don't have a password state variable, so we'll have to create it. And again, you can just initialize it to be an empty string. All right, and then we'll have to create that new field. Then we'll need to create a function called password handler, which is going to look pretty much the same as the email handler. And how does that look? Doesn't look very good. give our form a class of we'll call that class form group. Make sure we're using our components.css file. Okay. These labels here, but we didn't add any text. Alright, that's alright for now. Okay, so let's see if it works. So we enter in a good email. But we enter in a bad password. Alright, we get nothing. Sorry if you hear this noise outside. I'm in Tokyo, and particularly in Tokyo, you've got these trucks that go around and they call out to everyone for all of their broken or unwanted items. They're basically recycle shops. And unfortunately, on a Sunday evening, they think that's the best way to make everybody in the neighborhood happy. Alright, so let's try it one more time with a valid email and a valid password. And if you forgot what your password is, you can just go back to the server side into your db.js. Pretty easy. ABC123. Alright, let's try it. ABC123. And it looks like we're able to log in. Good. So it's working. So that wasn't really too bad, although it took a little bit of time. I think that once you get used to dealing with Apollo client and knowing where your information is going to be stored and saved on the front end and how to manipulate things, you won't have too much trouble with it. So for now, we'll end here, and I'm not so sure when the next video will come up, but right now it's December 29th. I'm not confident that we'll get one in before the end of the year, but I think up to this point, you've seen most of what you can do with Apollo, both on the server side and the client side. We've used both Apollo server and Apollo client to make our full stack application, which of course, is in no way a good application at all. We were more interested in demonstrating functionality than anything. But like I said, I hope that this has helped you to get a really good idea about how you can put together a full stack Apollo application. And going forward, we'll look at other things to do, like maybe more mutations and also possibly deployment. But for now, I'll wrap it up. And as always, I thank you for checking me out. Have a nice New Year's holiday, and I'll see you next year. Cheers.